Okay, so zero grazing systems. What is their future in the Australian dairy industry? Our next speaker, Scott McDonald from Agriculture Victoria, is one of Australia's leading technical experts in farm infrastructure, effluent system design and dairy housing. With over 30 years of experience and 2,000 plus farm visits under his belt, Scott knows what works and what doesn't. Everybody, please put your hands together and welcome Scott McDonald to the stage with herd improvement in zero grazing systems.
Thanks, Eugene. I've cut in the afternoon tea, sorry about that. Zero grazing, it's sort of one of those topics, we're talking about grazing industries, I'm talking about zero grazing. So from the Australian dairy industry's point of view, you'll understand that it's a grazing industry. I have to put the disclaimer in, it will always be a grazing industry. There's lots of commentary at the moment, there's a bit of hype around intensification and cows going in the sheds. I've heard statements that half the industry will intensify, most of the milk will come from intensive systems. End of the day, it doesn't really matter where milk comes from. So Australian dairy is grazing, it will continue to grazing, most farms will graze and so they should. Percentage of the farms over the last 15 years have decided that grazing is extremely problematic. So these farms are actually transitioning into systems which we call intensive zero grazing. People often want to know what's the percentage of farms that are actually not putting cows on paddocks based on all the data coming to us, and we get probably 90% of the inquiries around Australia. So comparing our data with Dairy Australia and with the private sector, we work pretty closely. I would tell you 6 to 7% of the Australian dairy industry is currently intensified or are in the process of intensifying. The stats tell us that 6 to 10% is probably producing 20% of Australia's milk as we speak. So the industry is changing, farm systems. Victoria's actually moved ahead, believe it or not, and I'm not saying that because I work for the government. Victoria is the only state in Australia which has changed its planning laws in relation to dairy. So in 2009 I started writing the Victorian free stall guidelines. We had 3 free stalls in Victoria at the time. As Yi Cheng said, I walked on 2,000 farms, so lots of cups of coffee around kitchen tables, so we know what the industry's doing because we spent a lot of time talking to them. We wrote freestall guidelines in 2009. We didn't use the word intensive because we weren't technically an intensive industry. 2016, we started to move a little bit. The industry started to creep into these sheds. There was an opportunity to change the Victorian planning scheme. So when you work for government, you can talk to the Agricultural Minister. I showed the Agriculture Minister 120 clients I've been working with who weren't going to graze cows anymore. The Ag Minister says, let's put dairy into the planning scheme as intensive. So in 2018, the Victorian planning scheme introduced intensive dairy farms into planning, which is great for Victorians because farmers building these barns now had a pathway. Without that pathway, these farmers would have to wrestle with the cattle code, beef feedlot cattle code. Separation distances, feedlots is absolutely horrendous. We could talk 3, 4, 5 k's from the nearest neighbour. You apply the very limited data for dairy, we're talking 500 metres. So it's important to actually create a pathway. Definition of grazing is very simple, meaningful, government jargon, meaningful intention to graze, browse or forage, grazing. Intensive is feeds coming into the cows. There's not a percentage, it's basically it's a house system. So the planning scheme actually identifies grazing animal production, which is actually good because it separates those with the big concrete feed pads where cows are being fed partial mixed rations, so it actually separates those sort of systems. And basically says you're a Section 1. Section 1, no planning permit required, which is fantastic. You have the right to graze. You have the right to build infrastructure. So there's going to be droughts, fires, there's going to be seasonal downturns, there's going to be hot weather, cold weather. Grazing is going to be problematic. So you can build feed pads, concrete roof feed pads, cattle shelters, the earth and PMR sort of stuff, no permit required. Provided you don't hit an overlay, you don't stick it next to the creek, obviously. So that sort of separated those sort of systems. Important thing to remember is that Some of these systems look quite intensive. You look at some of those pictures, it's easy to walk into a big shed and think that looks pretty intensive. So you look at the bottom photos, that's in Gippsland, 10 o'clock in the morning. It's a 1,200 cow herd. It's drizzly, wet weather, typical sort of Gippsland winter. Where are the cows? They're out in that shitty weather. Why aren't they in the shed? Because they don't live in the shed. They're only in that shed at night over winter. It's a management strategy for the farm to mitigate pugging up his farm with 1,200 cows at night. The other shed, you can see the big top on the left. That's a 1,200 cow feed pad roof shelter. It's not intensive because it's concrete. Cows don't live on concrete. So it's important not only for the industry but for government planning agencies to understand the type of facilities. Because just because they're big sheds with cows in them, it doesn't mean they're farming intensively. So as I said, intensive dairy farm was introduced. There are 3 types of systems in Australia which we would say, if you build these systems, you are intensive or heading down the pathway, because these facilities are designed not to graze animals. Early on, we were hearing stupid terms like grazing freestall. You're spending $10,000 a cow to put into a luxury facility and you're going to put them out in the paddock. Never going to happen. So the 3 types of systems which we would say Australia-wide fit into that category: freestalls, loose housing, composite bedding pack barns and dry lots. You travel to the US and you'll hear the word freestall barns. We don't have freestall barns in Australia. We separated the terminology. More from a planning perspective, freestalls, 100% of the manure is going down the alley, whereas the loose house and composted barns, 1/3 of the manure is going down as sludge, the other 2/3 is the bedding compost. As soon as you mention the word compost, it brings in connotations of potential odour. So we separated those facilities to navigate EPA sort of licence. These facilities are designed, as I said, for cows to live in. In Victoria and in other states, it's a change of land use. It basically means get a permit. So getting a permit requires an environmental impact statement. So they're not simple documents. We've seen environmental impact statements, 700 to 1,000 pages. To navigate all the government agencies, you need an effluent management plan by a professional designer, and you need environmental impact plans, which basically is the operational side. So you need those 3 documents to navigate planning. Obviously you can navigate planning because there's quite a lot of successful developments. We spend a lot of time talking to farmers about why you're transitioning. So our role is not to tell farmers how to farm. We basically sit down, have a discussion. What are your drivers? What are your motivators? We will tell you that the farmers that are transitioning into these large intensive systems, there's 35 drivers that they're throwing up. So heat stress during summer, there's winter pugging pastures, there's improved genetics, our cows are better off in sheds, labour efficiencies, feed wastage, they'll throw them all up. If they're throwing up a few ideas and basically put in a feed pad, keep grazing, improve your production. But if you've got so many drivers, it's the crossover from a PMR feed pad sort of infrastructure into a house system. So these are the drivers. There's a great piece of work done by the University of Melbourne, which has categorised a lot of testimonies from farmers about why you're making this change. These changes are not overnight decisions. The farms we work with, the early adoptions were 5-6 years of planning, trying to get into these sort of systems. One of the big drivers was production. So some of you may have heard, if you went to raise on the roof up in the Hunter Valley last year, Mandy D from the D's farm, high genetics, genetics, you know that farm. Mandy spoke at the conference, said they had a cow at 305 days lactation do 18,800 litres of milk. That cow's not doing that, walking down paddocks, walking 4 or 5 kilometres in the hot sun. So we talk very much about the cows going into these facilities. One of the big drivers is you've got to have the right cows. The cow has to earn the right to walk into that shed, because we know the farmers that are transitioning to these systems are spending anywhere between $6,000 to $10,000 per cow. So that cow's got to actually deserve to go in there. Most of you would be familiar, so typical freestall setup, they're not just big sheds, they have manure alleys. Freestalls have the stalls, the cubicles where cows actually sit, mostly bedding. Material is sand. some rubber mattresses, combination of bedding. As an effluent designer, we can tell you we hate sand in the manure stream. Taking out sand out of manure is quite complex. You can see the sand lanes in some of these systems, so it's hundreds of thousands of dollars of concrete just to settle the sand, then return it back into the bedding material. Lots of flood wash systems, obviously, fans, ventilation, very complex sheds. These we say they're around the $10,000 per cow to get them into these sheds, because there's lots of infrastructure, lots of moving parts, fairly big. The loose housing barns are sort of similar, but the bedding pack's been replaced. The bedding pack replaces the actual stalls, free stalls. So the loafing barns, what the industry is still learning and what the consumers doesn't understand, that these loose housing barns, we talk a minimum 12 square metres per animal. So they're not confined, they're not tied up in little areas. They get a minimum 12, 16 square metres for each animal in those sheds, hence the size of some of these sheds. So the loafing areas are either inside, the cows feed centrally, or they feed outside, but the loose housing barns are probably the most popular system in Australia at the moment. The dry lots obviously come out of the US, California. Farmers in southern New South Wales went to California, come back and started building dry lots. These are intensive systems because cows are fed TMR, they don't go out in the paddock. So very similar in relation to feedlots, but we don't call them feedlots. From a dairy perspective, you mentioned the word feedlot, good luck getting through planning. The local planning guys downloading the cattle code and trying to figure out how you fit. So these look fairly primitive, rudimentary in design, but I can tell you there's fairly sophisticated engineering around these systems. Slope, drainage, shedding water, roof rainfall being removed from the area feeding, so they might look like they're earthen. We call them dry lots, not feed lots. Serious engineering to get water off these areas pretty quick. So most of these are a stepping stone into the barns. A lot of the research has been done for years, but the farms are moving into these, are starting to find the benefits. These are some information that's in the currently national guidelines. This is for 300 cow dairy, 300 cows, so we talk about rumen stability, going from PMR to TMR. We know if you stabilise and get the feed mix right, feed the cow better, cow's going to do better. So you look at the production, 28 kilograms in a PMR feeding grass as well as supplements, as opposed to cows getting the full diet sorted out properly. Significant gains. A lot of the drivers for these big sheds was walking cows. Some of the large herds were walking 5-6 kilometres every day to get to the dairy. And you look at the production losses from some of these herds. This is for 300 cows. 300 cows, they worked out they've lost 14,000 litres a year in milk. Half a litre potentially every kilometre on flat terrain, up to a litre. So imagine that's a 3,000 cow herd walking 6 kilometres. How much milk is that farm losing getting these cows in and out of the shed each day? Heat stress, well known, well documented. Savings in heat stress. There's a lot of 1%ers the farmers tell us from these sheds. It's not just production, animal welfare and comfort. We're no longer pugging our pastures. We're saving money on pastures. We're saving money on fertiliser because we've got more manure we can capture. Labour efficiencies. These farms talk about the 1%ers, and yet all the 1%ers up, they make significant gains. But big systems, so some of the trend data says, this is no surprising, the different colours represent the different systems. As you can see, over the last 15 years there's been a steady increase of inquiries. I said pre-2010 there wasn't a lot of interest, a lot of those were still exploring. Farmers travel. You can see these inquiries that have come through in Agriculture Victoria and Dairy Australia over the last 15 years. There's a spike. We knew this was coming. We wrote the guidelines in 2009, knew when this was coming. If you look at some of the regions, that's probably some of the surprises. Northern Victoria, hot, dry country, flat country, wet winter, hard to manage herds. Southern New South Wales, didn't expect to get free stalls and loose housing barns in Gippsland. High rainfall, absolute pasture dominant region. We're getting inquiries. Late last year, inquiries in Tasmania. Free stalls being built in Tasmania, which you would think are absolute pasture dominant. But some farms have got that point in their life, they're saying managing pastures is so problematic, we have to take all those variables out of the equation. We are building facilities, we have complete control. So the trend data is saying, yep, they're going up everywhere. New South Wales, Northern Victoria in particular, will continue to grow. We've had probably 20 inquiries in Northern Victoria in the last 2 months. So bit of a growth phase. We'd say the early adopters, the innovators have come through. So you know most of the names, they're well known, well documented, the Walpoles, the Climos, the Vidacombs, the Mulcays, the Moxies, everyone knows these in the industry. Early adopters, innovators, these systems are up and running. The next wave of people that are coming through are probably not as well prepared. We're sort of hearing stuff, they haven't got the genetics, their production's not as good. They've got the wrong system. We've had inquiries about mixed herds going in the free stalls. You can't put mixed herds in free stalls because you want a uniform cow, you want the shit going in the alley, not on the sand bedding. So a lot of inquiries. The next wave coming through are probably not as prepared. A lot more discussion about, is this the right system for you? These are some of the things you've got to consider. There's a great program we've built with Dairy Australia called the Farm System Evaluator. We built that tool last year, very complex decision support tool. That's been put in place to slow the industry down in relation to intensification. Goes for the tool, 12 key performance indicators, breeding is one of them, milk production, all that sort of stuff. That tool's pretty harsh. If you get black, and most of the farms we ran through get a black score on certain key performance indicators, that's basically, if you proceed, you're leaving the industry. You will fail. So a reality check, which is good. No surprise, I said most intensive systems, the preference is barns. Thinking why? Because we have a lot of mixed herds, putting cows in shed produces a lot of manure, which is instant bedding material. The other reason we think it's the farms are coming out of grazing, particularly Northern Victoria, grazing, water, irrigation. So putting cows into a bedding pack barn where they can roam around, I said 12, 16 square metres. That's a bit of a gentle transition from going from grazing to a cubicle in a free stall. I said 67% of the barns, 30 odd free stalls. Some of those barns are being designed to be converted into free stall. So it's a stage into the barn. The bedding pack will be replaced with stalls down the track. But at this stage, the industry is pushing towards these barns. No surprise if this is basically the big herds are in the free stalls. So the 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 cow dairies, they're going in the free stalls where the cows, the high genetic animals that are around 180 cow size herds up to the 800s are going into the barns. That's what the data is telling us at the moment. It will switch over time, but there's large sheds. Coombuna at the moment's got 5,200 cows in sheds, don't graze, they're producing a lot of milk. The Walpoles are pushing the 3,000, Climos and the Shannons, all 3,000 set up, all stage in the development. Important part is that in understanding sheds, they're not just big sheds, they're not just concrete and steel where cows live. There's a lot of emphasis in the design, the engineering around cow comfort, cow behaviour, cow welfare. So we talk about the slope the cow's got to walk up, we'll talk about 1% slope, we talk about alleyway width, access to feed, access to water, we talk about ventilation, cooling, water, bedding, material bedding, management. There's a lot of engineering stuff goes into building these sheds. And like I said, the centre point is that, is the cow going to be comfortable? Why would you put a cow in a shed that's poorly designed? Because you're not grading anything. So a lot of work goes into the design. And long-term, looking at sustainability, as I said early on, it's not an overnight transition. We've had farmers years ago come up and say, we're going to go into a free stall. And the conversation back then, before we had planning schemes that identified these systems, conversation is 4 years. Before those cows walk into that shed you're proposing, it'll be 4 years because no one's heard of these systems. There was one proposed down in Gippsland in around 2016. 1,000 cows in the one free stall, not complicated. They had 406 objectors, which generated over 460 complaints about a dairy system they knew nothing about. End of the day, farm went under. You're never building a free stall when you've got 406 people complaining about it. There's even complaints in the US, believe it or not. but because they rung the local council, it has to be registered. Bass Coast Council said they lost $66,000 in just dealing with phone calls and people ringing in about this development they knew nothing about. So there's a lot of environmental planning. We talk a bit more tomorrow about the sustainability, but these systems are now built for biogas. We've done the feasibility studies. We know you put 1,000 cows on concrete, a lot of manure coming in. It's actually worth considering anaerobic digestions and biogas. I'm on my last slide, Shane, so I can see the big shadow coming across on the right. So the good news is that the last few years we've spent a lot of time working very closely with Dairy Australia. So there is so much research, there's so much data put up on their website. So this is only a snapshot. You go into Dairy Australia, the national guidelines are there. That took us 2 years. So thanks to Ian and Jeff, they wrote chapters. We picked 13 subject matter experts from around the world to write these guidelines. It took 2 years. And now it's up here. They tell us it's the world first. No other country's ever written national guidelines on contained housing. We've done it with the help of 13 experts. So that's up there, along with the system evaluator tool. There's economics on the TMR systems. There's a whole lot of videos and podcasts around these farmers who built these and made a successful transition. So it's sort of a scary world. I speak a lot around intensification. Some farmers are quite shocked. Government agencies don't get it. I spend a lot of time talking to other states, government agencies saying it's okay. There's a freestall coming. But it's just the concept of large animals living in sheds, not walking out the pasture. So, but it's okay. And it's not the whole industry, it's only a part of the industry. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Scotty. I'd never thought I'd find concrete and effluent interesting until spending time with you, so thank you. We do have some questions that have come through on Slido. So we have a question from Steph. How do we future-proof these farms in terms of increasing market desire for pasture access, a movement that we're seeing in housed systems in Europe?
Tough question. Yes, it's sort of... A lot of farmers would make an early transition, were dabbling in. It was hard to let go of grazing. When you graze, and suddenly so they're putting into the dry lots, and they'll figure, oh, we'll feed them TMR and we'll put them out in the paddock because it feels good. The cows are not eating the grass, they're shitting on it because they're being fed a full ration diet. So you sort of can't dabble between grazing and TMR feeding. Some have gone into the loafing areas so the cows can go outside these sheds in the outdoor loafing. You think the cow wants to go outside in the outdoor loafing area? They've got everything they need, comfort-wise, air conditioning, feed. They don't want to leave the shed. Sometimes it's hard to get them out of the bedding back into the dairy and back and forward. So it's different, but yeah, it's usual because of the other industries like poultry, free-range birds. That's not going too well. So some of the intensive industries are trying to go into grazing, whereas dairy is a grazing industry. Parts of it trying to go into intensive, but it's the image for the consumer. Cows in sheds is not a concept that gets around your head too much, but
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Great question. Question number 2, is community preference, so choice or grazing, built into the risk assessment tool used to guide farmers?
Yeah, it's anyone doing intensive stuff, we run what we call 2 sorts of meetings. We run a community meeting. Some of these big developments, we run community meetings because if you don't warm up the community and explain to the community what's going on, when they put the application in, they'll get objections. We don't want another Kernot with 400 people complaining. So we sort of work on the community. Communities and farming zones are not too bad, but doesn't mean necessarily you're going to get a neighbour who's opposed it. So one of the biggest farms developments we worked on was the Mulcahy's up in Kai Valley. Absolutely one of the best barns you're going to see in Australia. They had 17 neighbours. I said to Peter, I said, you've got to go tell your 17 neighbours what you're doing. He went and told all his 17 neighbours, he got no complaints because the neighbours understood what was going on. So it's about prepping the community, all the resources on Dairy Australia, and the farmer testimonies of why they're doing it. They're putting these animals in these sheds because they love their animals. It's as simple as that.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. Thank you very much, Scotty. I think that's probably all we've got time for the moment, although please feel free to talk to Scotty about these questions that are coming through on the Slido now. For the moment, though, let's put our hands together in appreciation. Sorry, I almost forgot that.